Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming. Not the nicest of nights to come out. Hello, good evening to you watching at home. Gary's stolen my thunder, actually, because I usually start these talks with an apology by saying that the title and the cover of my book, The Mercenary River, would lead you to believe, perhaps, that it was a book about the River Thames. And it's not, I say. And there are usually some disappointed looks around the place. I say it is in fact a history of London's water supply, and I then apologise for that, but I say it doesn't say that on the cover, because if it said a history of London's water supply, nobody would buy it. So the publishers and I engaged in a little bit of subterfuge. Why would nobody buy it? Well, there's this notion about somehow that water supply is boring. I think people believe that it's about pumps and pipes and technology, and for most people, engineers accepted, that doesn't sound terribly interesting. What they don't realise is that supplying water to a city like London over 400 years, a city that was among the fastest growing and largest cities in the world, with the technology then available and all the other resources available, was extraordinarily challenging. It was not simply a sort of engineering technological challenge. It was a political challenge. And one of the significant things about London's water supply and its history is that in the 19th century, it was a really big national political issue. It was also a business challenge, because when London really took off in size, business was in its infancy, and clever people had to develop ways of organizing business, ways of doing business that nobody had thought of before, but which have come down to us, which have influenced the way in which subsequent business has operated. So my book it's a political history, it's a business history, it's a social history, because it tells you quite a lot about the way people used water. It is a scientific history, particularly about the science of public health and the way that developed. And yes, it is a technological and engineering history. And because of all this, it's got an awful lot in it, which of course I can't possibly touch on in a sort of 40-minute lecture. So there are lots of things in the book that I am not going to talk about tonight. I am not going to talk, for instance, about fraudulent accounting in Victorian business, though there is a chapter about that. I am not going to talk about the history of local government in London and its relevance to the water business, although there is a chapter about that as well. And I am not going to tell you why one water company in the 1870s knowingly cut off several thousand people, even though it was aware they had no alternative source of water and were unlikely to have for many weeks, maybe months. I'm not going to tell you about that, and if you want to know about that, you're going to have to buy the book. And as luck would have it, at the back of the hall, and I will be selling them in the interval, take cash or card, discounted prices, sign everyone. I have brought along both hardback and paperback copies. That's enough hard sell. So, what am I going to talk about? Well, I'm going to start by talking about this. Some of you may know it. It's called the New River, even though it's not new and it's not a river. It's not a river because it's an aqueduct, constructed originally to bring water to the City of London from Hertfordshire, and it's not new because it was completed in 1613, over 400 years ago. And remarkably, for something so old, it is still a fully functioning part of London's water supply. 10% of London's drinking water comes down the New River every day and goes off. We don't drink it unpurified. It goes off to a water treatment plant at Coppermills in the Lee Valley, just near Walthamstow. Originally, the water came from springs near Ware in Hertfordshire. Those have dried up now. Most of the water today comes out of the River Lee. And if you want to go for a walk, nice walk along the river from Ware to Hertford or Hertford to Ware, you will pass about halfway between the two this building, which is called New Gauge. It was constructed in the 1850s And every day, a maximum of 22.5 million gallons of water comes out of the Lee into the top of the New River through that aperture at the back. And the New River is interesting for a number of reasons. The fact that it's still there and still functioning is interesting. But one of the reasons I find it fascinating is because of the man who made it happen. He was called, slight adjustment. I'm too tall for the camera, is that it? Yes, so people at home can only see my chin. Okay, is that better? That's much better, all right. But if I get too close, you get chin only, right? Sorry about that, people. I shall try and keep a proper distance. One reason it's interesting is because of the man who constructed it and then went on to run the New River Company, which took New River water and sold it to Londoners. And he was called Hugh Middleton. And there's a statue of him, this one, on Islington Green in North London. There's another one on the Royal Exchange building opposite the Bank of England in the city. And there's another one, this one, at one of the four corners of Holborn Viaduct. And Middleton was a goldsmith, which meant that he was a rich London merchant. Goldsmiths were sort of venture capitalists, bankers. If you wanted something done and you wanted to fund it, going to a goldsmith was a good idea. But he was unusual because he was also extremely forward-thinking and extremely entrepreneurial. And the Victorians understood what a great guy he was. They put up all these statues. Interestingly, so did his contemporaries, because in due course, he became a baronet, allowed to call himself Sir Hugh Middleton and pass the title on to his heirs. And very unusually, because the title of baronet had been invented by King James I as a money-making wheeze, he didn't have to pay for it. He got it free. But although he was a rich man, he wasn't rich enough to fund the construction of the New River entirely by himself. So he formed what he called a venture. Now, ventures were not unknown in Elizabethan England. They were what was known as joint stock companies. So a bunch of merchants would get together, they would hire a ship, they would buy a cargo to go on it, they would send it off, it would come back, they'd sell the cargo, everybody would make a profit, and they'd all take their money out of this venture, which would then be dissolved. And these joint stock ventures, as I say, were becoming really quite common in Elizabethan times, but they weren't permanent. And the problem Middleton had was that you couldn't parcel up and sell off a water conduit like you could the contents of a ship. He had to have a permanent joint stock arrangement. And this was a first. In my book, I argue that the New River Company was the first permanent joint stock company in England. And because England was ahead of the pack in most of these things, it was therefore probably the first in the world. And all subsequent business corporations, for good or for ill, are descended from the New River Company because they are all permanent joint stock companies. The shares exist in perpetuity until someone decides to liquidate or dissolve the company. And the model, rather imperfect model for that, but the model was the New River Company. Who were these shareholders? Well, here's two of them. Like Middleton, rich London oligarchs. The one on the right, Peter van Loren, was a Dutchman, reputed to be the richest commoner in England in the reign of James I. The one on the left was a chap called, I used to say he was called Sir John Backhouse. I read somewhere the other day that he was called Samuel Backhouse. So let's call him John Samuel Backhouse. And he got involved because he owned the land on which the New River terminated. This conduit ran down from Hertfordshire 41 miles, following a sort of circuitous route, hugging the 100-foot contour to the west of the River Lee, and it needed a reservoir at the southern end from which supplies could be sent out to customers in the city. And Backhouse owned a piece of land on rising ground between Clerkenwell and Islington, where there was a duck pond. And Middleton went up to him presumably one day and said, "Backhouse, your duck pond is just what I need for my reservoir." And so that's what the Backhouse's duck pond became. And you can see that Backhouse was rather proud of his association with the New River, because when he had his portrait painted some years later, he asked the artist to include a little landscape picture of New River Head, as it was called, in the portrait, and his arm is resting on it. And you can see here, there is a rather irregular piece of water surrounding a circular walled reservoir, and in the middle, there is a building which was called the Waterhouse, imaginatively, which contained the pipes and the cocks controlling the supply of water to customers. Come back to New River Head in a second. There was also another very important shareholder, and that was this man, King James I. What happened was that Middleton got started on constructing this aqueduct. He had an Act of Parliament which authorised him to do it, but some of the landowners along the route started cutting up rough, it's not entirely clear why, and threatened to get an act that would rescind Middleton's act. And Middleton, who was obviously no slouch politically, as well as all his other attributes, neutralised this opposition by going straight to the very top. He went to the king and he made the king an offer. He said, "If you support my venture to the extent of putting up half the cost of construction, I will give you a half share in my venture, and what's more, 50% of the profits." And James thought that sounded like a good deal, which it was, and acquiesced, and miraculously all the opposition just faded away. Unfortunately, James I's son, Charles I, one of our less successful kings, was not as shrewd as his father. When he succeeded to the throne, he inherited this stake in the New River, which the New River Company, which was by then profitable, but had not yet generated enough cash to pay off his father's initial investment. And Charles, of course, was desperate for cash. It was one of the causes of the civil wars. And so he sold his 50% share in the New River Company back to Hugh Middleton for £500 down and £500 a year in perpetuity. Now, when I tell you that the New River Company went on to become the most profitable company in British history, you will see that this was a mistake. Why do I say it was the most profitable? Well, an historian in the 1980s sat down and worked out that if one of those original shareholders had, by some miracle, survived from 1619, when the company was incorporated, right through until 1904, and it was bought out with the other London water companies by the Metropolitan Water Board, essentially nationalised, he, and of course they were all men, he would have enjoyed a return on his initial investment of 267% per year. That's taking account of dividends received over the centuries and the final purchase price. And I defy you to find me any investment, legitimate investment, which over such a long time, such a long period, could be anything like as profitable. So Charles I, not a very clever king. There is another picture of New River Head. You see the duck pond, rather irregularly shaped. You see the wall around the circular reservoir. You see the Waterhouse in the background. You see a big church. That is Old St. Paul's Cathedral, which tells us that this picture dates from before the Great Fire of London in 1666. And there is a later picture from about 1700. By now we've got Christopher Wren's St. Paul's in the background. You can see they've tidied up the rather straggly duck pond, put a fence around it, squared it off a bit. But you can still see in the middle of the picture the circular reservoir of the New River and the Waterhouse. You can also see two other things of interest. You can see something that looks like a windmill, and in the foreground you can see another rectangular reservoir. The thing that looks like a windmill was a windmill. It was a particularly unsuccessful windmill, revolutionary design. It had 6 sails, not the conventional 4, and they all blew off in strong winds, not once but twice. So they abandoned the windmill, and instead they employed a horse to go round and round doing the work that the windmill would have done, go round and round inside the base of the windmill. Why did they need a windmill or a horse mill? They needed to drive a pump. Up until 1700, one of the reasons the New River Company was so profitable was that all its water was delivered purely by gravity. It came down the New River by gravity, and then it flowed down to customers in the city by gravity. There was no pumping, and pumping is expensive. But London was growing. It was expanding westwards, and the New River Company wanted to be able to serve these lucrative new areas, places like Soho and Covent Garden and Bloomsbury. But it discovered that the head of pressure from its original reservoir was not strong enough to force the water westwards. So it decided to build a second reservoir, and that is what you can see in the foreground, higher up the hill with a greater head of pressure, and it installed the pumps to get the water from the first reservoir, the circular one, up to the second one. And that second reservoir is also still there, also still a fully functioning part of London's water supply. It's at the top of Pentonville Road. If you go up Pentonville Road from King's Cross towards the Angel Islington, just as you get to the top of the hill, on the right there is a square called Claremont Square, surrounding, it's now covered over and grassed over, surrounding that reservoir, still serving the purpose for it which it was originally built. There is another photograph of New River Head, taken just before the First World War. The outer pond by this stage has become filter beds for purifying the water. There's the circular reservoir, and on the right, somewhere buried in that kind of clump of houses, is the original water house, and it's all gone now to be replaced by that, which was completed in the 1920s as a headquarters for the new Metropolitan Water Board that had taken over all of London's water supply. And virtually all traces of New River Head, the old original New River Head, have disappeared, with a couple of important exceptions. If you go round the back of that 1920s building, you'll see these two structures. The one in the background was built in the 18th century originally and expanded subsequently to house steam engines, because in due course horse mills and windmills were replaced by steam engines, and is inside it, buried inside it, there is the oldest surviving steam engine house, steam engine place in London. Steam engines, of course, in the 19th century were ubiquitous. This is the oldest surviving example of a purpose-built steam engine house. And in the foreground, you can see all that's left of that original windmill. They chopped the top off it, but kept the bottom for the horses, and then later as a storeroom. And for years, these buildings were for decades, lay empty and unloved. They were owned by Thames Water, who didn't know what to do with them. Now they have been taken over by something called the Quentin Blake Centre for Illustration, which is a museum of illustration, which has been set up by Quentin Blake, as the name suggests, and they're going to be opening it, assuming they can complete raising the money, in the not too distant future. And it's wonderful that these buildings have found a use at last. There's one other survival of old New River Head, that is inside that big 1920s building, and it's this. These days it's called the Oak Room, but originally it was called the Court Room, because it was where the New River Company's Court of Directors met. And it was installed in the 1690s in that original waterhouse. And when they knocked the waterhouse down, this was the only bit they kept. They cut it all up and reassembled it in the new building. And it's a very, very splendid interior indeed. It has a tremendously ornate plaster ceiling. In the middle of the ceiling, you can't see it in this picture, there is a portrait of the king at the time, William III. There are wonderfully elaborate wood carvings on the walls, which may conceivably be by Grinling Gibbons, the great wood carver of the era, or by somebody he taught. And it's, amongst other things, it tells you, first of all, how much money the New River Company had to spend on its headquarters, but also it tells you what the New River Company thought of itself in the 1690s. It was a very, very significant and substantial player in the land. permanent joint stock companies became more common as the 17th century wore on, but in 1700 there were really only three of significance. One was the East India Company, one was the Bank of England, and the third was the New River Company. What, you may be wondering, did Londoners do for water before the New River Company came along? And just give me a second, I'll tell you. Some of them, if they didn't have any money, literally went down to the Thames and dipped a bucket in. Quite a lot had wells on their property in their backyards or in their cellars. And if you didn't want to do either of those, you could queue up at one of these. These were conduit houses, a network of them. There were eventually 16 put up by the city authorities and by benefactors during the Middle Ages and the early part of the Tudor period. And they supplied water free, and the water came from springs outside the city walls in lead pipes. And if you didn't want to go yourself to the conduit head or send your servants, you could buy water from water carriers who themselves filled up at the conduits and then hawked it round from house to house. And in the foreground there, you can see with a curious shaped tankard, it was called, over his shoulder, a London water carrier. There is another picture of a London water carrier. The problem was that by the reign of Elizabeth, these were hopelessly inadequate. London expanded from a population of about 50,000 in 1500 to 4 times that, about 200,000 in 1600, and there simply wasn't enough water. That was the spur for creating the New River. It was also the spur for an earlier attempt to solve London's water crisis, which was called the London Bridge Waterworks. Here is a picture of old London Bridge with the houses. And I know you won't believe me, but the bottom bridge is the same bridge in the 18th century after they demolished the houses and widened a couple of the arches. And in both pictures, you can see at the left hand, the northern end, you can see a wooden structure in the water. That is protecting the water wheels of the London Bridge Waterworks. In the 1580s, a Dutchman called Peter Moritz came to the city with a proposal, which they accepted. He installed a water wheel under originally just one arch, but later the thing expanded to include several arches. The water flow drove the wheel drove the pump, river water was pumped up into a tank, and then it was distributed to customers in the city. Moritz did something that nobody had done before. He laid pipes under the city streets, and he positively encouraged anybody whose house lay along the route of one of his pipes to make a connection to his pipe, provided they paid him. And this, I would argue, is the first example of what we have become very accustomed to in the modern world, a utility company. We all pay money regularly to people who supply us through networks with water, with power, with gas, with telecommunications. Somebody had to do it first. Moritz did it first. And when the New River Company came along, it borrowed this model, borrowed this business model. London Bridge Waterworks survived right through until the demolition of Old London Bridge in 1831. Here is Old London Bridge in the 1820s. You can see the water wheels at the far end. You may be wondering what the quality of the water was like, given that it came out of the Thames. This was a question that preoccupied contemporaries as well. There was a public inquiry in 1821, a parliamentary inquiry into London's water supply. This was the first of, by my reckoning, 16 parliamentary inquiries, select committees, royal commissions, and so on, looking into London's water supply during the course of the 19th century. I told you it was a major political issue. And during that inquiry, the superintendent of the London Bridge Waterworks gave evidence, and he was asked about the quality of his water, and he said, people like it. They like it because it is softer than New River water and therefore better for doing the laundry, which, as I hope to show you later, actually was not a trivial consideration given how important doing the laundry was. But his question is, yes, but what about drinking it? And the chap said, I wouldn't dream of drinking it. The pipes which the New River Company and the London Bridge Waterworks laid were made of wood. They were made of elm logs, bored out, laid end to end, mostly, as I say, buried under the streets. Occasionally you saw them above ground. These are the New River Company's mains, crossing the valley of the River Fleet in the direction of Bloomsbury and Soho Square and so on. And it won't surprise you to learn that they leaked, nothing new about leaking water mains. And they weren't full of water. If they were, all the time. If they were, they would have leaked even worse. What happened was that the water companies employed chaps like this. He's a turncock, and it was his job to go round the streets on a regular schedule, turning on the water in each neighbourhood for a couple of hours every couple of days. So you needed to know when the water was going to be on in your district, or alternatively, you needed something to keep it in. So Londoners invested in cisterns and tanks and in water butts. This is a picture by a wonderful artist called George Shaft, done in the 1820s, of his backyard, the backyard of his home in St Martin's Lane. And you can see on the right there a water butt, and above it you can see a pipe with a tap. That is the pipe coming in from the main in the street, and there's a tap on the water butt itself for drawing off water for cooking and washing and cleaning and so on, and it's conveniently close to the family privy, which is in the square building. This was fine if you were a middle-class householder and you had somewhere to keep your water butt or your water tank. Not so good if you were poor. If you were lucky, your landlord in the slum court that you inhabited in would install a standpipe like this. The landlord would pay money to the water company would turn the water on periodically and it would flow through, and you would pay a little bit extra in your rent to your landlord. If you were unlucky, he would install a communal tank or butt, and these were a byword for dirt and filth, and everything used to accumulate in them. People would wash their chamber pots in them, small boys would play games in them, rubbish of all kinds would accumulate in them, and it became a great scandal in the 19th century and one of the things that fueled the political controversy around water. As I say, the New River Company was extremely profitable and London was expanding, so not surprisingly, other water companies started up. Here is one of them. This was called the York Buildings Waterworks, and it stood roughly where Charing Cross Station is now. And here you can see this rather splendid rusticated structure. That is the old watergate of York House in the Strand. York House demolished. That is still there. It doesn't have its feet in the water anymore because they built the embankment in front of it. It's in Embankment Gardens, but it is still there and gives you an idea of where we're looking at. And the York Buildings Waterworks was followed in due course with lots of others. Top left, the Lambeth Waterworks with its intake and pumping station roughly where the Festival Hall is now. Top right, the Southwark Waterworks, which was at the southern end of where Southwark Bridge is now. Bottom right, the Battersea, Southwark and Vauxhall Waterworks, I beg your pardon, whose intake and pumping station was where Battersea Power Station is now. And bottom left, sorry, this has got slightly cut off, this image, the Chelsea Waterworks, whose intake was where the railway bridge into Victoria now goes, and whose reservoir was where Victoria Station sits. And that's no accident, because when the water company moved out, the railway company simply bought the land and built its station there. And they all had steam engines, filthy, polluting things. The York Buildings Waterworks actually had the very first steam engine ever erected for any purpose in London, very quickly unerected because the coal bill was astronomical, but steam engine technology improved over time, and they've all gone now, all those, with one exception. And if you want to know more about this, I recommend a visit. This is a waterworks built initially in the 1830s by Kew Bridge, where the South Circular Road crosses the Thames. It's on the north side. It was built for the Grand Junction Waterworks, and it's now the London Museum of Water and Steam. It contains lots of interesting exhibits, and it contains some of those steam engines. And I was a bit baffled before I researched this book about why some people, men mostly, let's face it, got so excited about stationary steam engines. I could see why you get excited about a locomotive pulling a train, but a steam engine just sort of, I'm a fan, I'm sold. They steam these from time to time, and when you see them in action, they are extraordinary. They're absolutely enormous. They're far too big to capture in a single photograph. They are surprisingly quiet and graceful in their operation. And the two I've just shown you, were built for this pumping station. They are in the premises originally constructed for them. And this museum also has an archive in which I found this photograph, which I love because it seems to me to sum up so much about Victorian Britain. It's a picture of the largest cylinder ever constructed for a Cornish steam pumping engine. Cornwall was the centre of steam pump manufacture because they had all these deep mines which were flooded all the time, so they needed powerful pumps to pump the stuff up. And so Cornish engineers and manufacturers were at the very leading edge. And this was it's lying on its side in the yard of the company that made it, which was a company called Harvey's in Hale, in North Cornwall. And I like this picture for what it says, as I say, about Victorian Britain. It's world-beating, it's technologically advanced, and frankly, it's riddled with class consciousness, because in the middle there, standing there with his top hat and his fur-lined collar, is Old Man Harvey, the boss. And on the left, you can see with his bowler hat, a middle manager. And on the right, in his flat cap, is the foreman. And the flat-capped foreman is holding up a scale which tells you that this monster was 12 feet in diameter. And it was made for export for a pumping station in the Netherlands. Money was to be made in water supply. So, of course, a lot of sharp businessmen got involved. The fat cats, they saw an opportunity, and a whole raft of new water companies started up after 1810, run by the most untrustworthy and disreputable bunch of people imaginable in many cases. But interestingly, they weren't as clever as they thought they were. They correctly saw an opportunity, but they made a big mistake. The economic nostrums of the time said that what was needed was competition. That was going to drive economic growth and wealth and so on. So they decided that they were going to compete with the existing water companies. What we now know, partly as a result of what happened after 1810, is that water supply, like a number of other utilities, is a natural monopoly. It does not make sense for 2 or 3 different outfits to come along and dig up the same streets and install all this expensive infrastructure and then compete for a share of it. It makes much more sense for just one company to go down the street and to take all the available business. Something that should be told, I think, to today's broadband providers, since I've got at least 3 now in my street. But they found that out the hard way. And there was a period known as London's Water Wars, which was absolutely disastrous, and nobody made any money. Even the New River Company didn't actually go into a loss, but its dividends collapsed because they were trying to compete with the New River Company as well. And in 1817, north of the river, and rather later south of the river, all these competing companies came to a secret arrangement. It had to be secret because several of them had acts of parliament authorizing their establishment, which expressly forbade them from doing something like this. They came to a series of secret arrangements and they split the town up among them. It made perfect economic sense. So you had a whole series of local monopolies, and there were finally, in the final analysis, there were 8 water companies in London. There was the New River Company serving the city and the north. There was the East London Waterworks serving the East End. There were 2 companies, the Grand Junction and the West Middlesex, serving what we would call the West End. There was the Chelsea Waterworks serving Westminster and Chelsea. There was the Kent Waterworks. There was the Southwark and Vauxhall Waterworks, and there was the Lambeth Waterworks. And those 2 last companies were the only two which had still significant area in which they overlapped and nominally competed with one another, which is important for something, a reason I'll come back to in a minute. And after they'd done these secret arrangements, carved the city up, what did they do? Yes, you guessed it, they put their prices up by 25%. And customers were outraged. They were absolutely appalled. And what followed from that was one of the very first consumer campaigns in history. Here's one example. This is a cartoon from the 1820s called John Bull's Waterworks, or Unfeeling Speculators Threatening to Cut Off One of the Necessaries of Life, or Necessities of Life. And it is, not to put too fine a point on it, a riot of cock jokes. These chaps with axes are water company turncocks, and they are threatening to cut off the cocks, in other words, the water supply, to anyone who doesn't pay the new outrageous charges. And you've got John Bull himself there on the right, straddling his cock, saying, for God's sake, don't cut it off. Got two little boys at the back there. One of them, poor little chap, has already lost his cock. The other one is about to. On the left, you have a lady straddling what she refers to as her husband's cock. And somebody at one of these talks once asked me, is there any sex in your book? And I said, this is a book about water supply. Then I remembered this cartoon. Don't you think she's showing an awful lot of leg? And I do wonder whether the implication is that if she leaves, if the turncock leaves her husband's cock alone, he may discover something to his benefit. And in the middle there, floating around, is a piece of paper on which is written, Bill in Parliament to authorise certain parishes to supply themselves with water to check the extortions of the monopolising companies. This is one of the first public manifestations of an idea which became more and more popular during the 19th century, which was that maybe, just maybe, it would be better if something so vital as water supply was not in the hands of private profit-making companies, but in the hands of some public body, publicly owned. And this suggests that the parishes, the forerunners of today's borough councils, should be that body, but other ideas were canvassed. You started about 10 minutes, I started about 10 minutes late, thanks to you guys, so I'm going to go on till 25 past. The problem that of rising prices was exacerbated by the fact that the water was frankly filthy. Almost all of it came out of the Thames or out of the River Lee, which were tidal and which were also the repositories for London's sewage. Looks quite nice in that picture, but actually the tidal Thames was absolutely full of sewage because it had nowhere else to go. Some clever chap had invented the flushing water closet. Conventional, traditional London cesspits were rapidly overwhelmed by the contents of flushing water closets, so they were all diverted into the existing sewers, which had only been designed to take rainwater runoff. And all of this stuff went into the rivers, which, as someone said, have now become one great cesspool. And this too was the subject of campaigning cartoons and pamphlets. This is a pamphlet called The Dolphin or Grand Junction Nuisance. And a dolphin is a structure, I didn't know this till I started researching the book. It's a structure in water designed to protect something. And the dolphin in this case is that thing that looks like an octagonal garden shed. And it's protecting the intake of the Grand Junction Waterworks, not the one whose pumping station still survived. This is an earlier one further downriver. And you can see the pumping station on the bank. And to give you an idea of where we are, that is the Royal Hospital Chelsea on the left. And between the two, you can see a channel. That is a sewer. And the author of the pamphlet pointed out that what came down the sewer was going to get sucked into the intake of the water company, wasn't it? And therefore, people were going to be sold a fluid saturated with the impurities of 50,000 houses, a dilute solution of animal and vegetable substances in a state of putrefaction, alike offensive to the sight, disgusting to the imagination, and destructive to health. And the author of the pamphlet wasn't wrong. The scientists backed him up. This is some pioneering microscopic analysis of London water from 1851. Found all sorts of things in the water, including muscle fibers, half-digested muscle fibers that the scientists involved thought could only have got there via the human gut. And as a result, he said, according to the present system of London's water supply, a portion of the inhabitants of the metropolis are made to consume a portion of their own excrement, and moreover, to pay for the privilege. And the cartoonists got in on this one too. This is called Monster Soup, commonly called Thames water. She's looking through a microscope. She's found all these nasty looking beasties in it. And she has been drinking a cup of tea, but you see it has fallen from her nerveless fingers the moment she's realized what's in the water. And there's another one too, from, in this case, rather inaptly named magazine Fun. Death's Dispensary, it's called. And there is Death dispensing water to the unsuspecting poor from a parish pump. And here is another cartoon. This is one of those water company turncocks on his rounds, and two little boys are watching him, and one of them is saying, "I say, Tommy, I'm blowed if there ain't a man a-turning on the cholera." Now, this is interesting because it comes from the 1840s. Cholera arrived in this country in 1835 and was absolutely devastating. It killed people. Nobody knew how it spread. It killed them immensely quickly. It was a horrible way to die, and there was no cure. The scientific establishment refused to accept that cholera, I beg your pardon, might be waterborne. The prevailing orthodoxy was that all disease was a product of what was known as bad air or miasma, bad smells. The general public, as represented by these two cartoonists, were having none of that. They were pretty sure that cholera was in the water, and they got there a long time before the scientists. The man who demonstrated conclusively that cholera is waterborne was this man, John Snow, one of my heroes, a pioneer of anesthesiology, but also a pioneer of epidemiology. There was a cholera outbreak in 1854 near his home in Soho, and he plotted on a map. This is the story, it's not quite true, but it'll do. He plotted on a map where people had died, and he realized that the deaths clustered around one street, Broad Street, now known as Broadwick Street. And he went and investigated, and he found a pump in Broadwick Street, and he persuaded the local authority to take the handle off the pump, and the outbreak stopped. And he took that as evidence that cholera was waterborne. And a year or two later, he looked at the statistics for that same cholera outbreak, which affected South London very badly. And he realized that that was the only part of London, you'll remember, where two water companies still competed with one another directly. And he found that in 1854, the number of deaths from cholera in households served by the Southwark and Vauxhall Company was 10 times higher than in households served by the Lambeth Waterworks. He concluded that that too was evidence that the cholera was waterborne. It was in the Southwark and Vauxhall water, it was not in the Lambeth water. And what is sad, he was absolutely right. And to us, that seems like a slam dunk. What is sad is that he died 2 or 3 years later, and he was still not believed by his scientific peers. He was mocked by the Lancet, who said, "Oh, he's gone down the sewers, he's gone mad." It wasn't until the 1860s, 8 or 10 years after he died, that public health experts in London finally realized that actually, you know what, Snow was right. Cholera is waterborne. Very quickly, why was there that difference between Southwark and Vauxhall and Lambeth water? Well, the Lambeth Waterworks in 1852, 2 years before the cholera, had moved its intake upriver from where the Festival Hall is now in the tidal Thames to above Teddington Lock, where the Thames is no longer tidal, to a place called Seething Wells, upstream from Kingston, Thames Ditton. The problem was that all this sewage went into the Thames. Because the Thames is tidal, it never left it. It would go out downstream with the tide, but then the incoming tide would bring it all back up again. And the chief engineer of the Lambeth Company, a man called James Simpson, another of my heroes, concluded that there was no way he could purify the water sufficiently, and so he persuaded his directors to make a big investment in a new intake and new pumping station up at Seething Wells. And so by 1854, when the cholera came along, the Southern Vauxhall was still serving up water from the polluted tidal Thames at Battersea. The Lambeth Company had moved to somewhere where the water was much cleaner. And Simpson did us all another great favor. He was the man who introduced the idea of filtering water to purify it to London. In 1852, the same year as Simpson voluntarily moved the Lambeth Waterworks, opened this new waterworks upstream, a plan he devised in the 1840s, the government finally and reluctantly passed a law which said that all London water companies are going to have to do the same thing. They were going to have to move their intakes away from the tidal Thames and the tidal Lee. What's more, they were going to have to filter their water using these slow sand filters, they're called, devised by Simpson. This is a picture of Hampton Waterworks in the 1890s. There are 3 pumping stations there belonging to 3 companies, the West Middlesex, the Southern Vauxhall and the Grand Junction, and in front is one of the filter beds. It's been emptied to clean the sand. And these filter beds, which are still used to purify 2/3 of London's water, very successful, very simple, very successful technology. They're a layer of gravel, layer of coarse sand, layer of thin sand, fine sand, pipes at the bottom to take the purified water away. You flood raw water from the river onto the top, and it trickles down through the sand and the gravel. And Simpson and his peers thought that these things worked mechanically, like a great big strainer. Actually, what we now know is that they work biologically, because what happens is that on the top layer, there forms something called, in German, a Schmutzdecke. It means slime blanket. And it's a layer of good bugs that eat all the bad bugs in the raw water. And what comes out of the bottom is 98% pure. As I say, 2/3 of London's water is still purified using slow sand filters. We have James Simpson to thank for that, and that is why he is one of my heroes. Right, let's move on a little bit. I put in some local interest, but didn't really get around to exploring it for shortage of time. As I said earlier, I have a short history of laundry. But just before that, I'm quite happy to answer any questions. If anybody's burning on the basis of what we've heard so far, and there's the other, oops, there's the other mic. Take the mic so they can hear you at home. Gentlemen here,
yep,
anybody,
coming over.
Anybody else?
Yeah, I'll just congratulate you again for a perfect, history resume of London, how London gets its freshest, cleanest water today, which isn't, the paradox is that a lot of people are worried about the standard of sewerage, which is pouring into the waterways more or less ad nauseum. I mean, why is this at this point in the century when we have the capacity to purify just about all the bad water that comes through, and there's still massive public concern.
There is a final chapter in the book which is largely about what has gone wrong with the water industry since it was re-privatized. The Victorians, to cut a long story short, learnt the hard way that it was a very good idea to bring water supply into public ownership rather than leave it in private hands. In London, that happened in 1904. In 1989, the Thatcher government re-privatized water, and they thought when they did so, they did it for perfectly good reasons, and for about 10 years, actually, it worked quite well. But they thought that the way to prevent water companies exploiting their monopoly position was to put in place a framework of regulation. And so we have a number of regulators, including Ofwat, which regulates the way the companies do business, and the Environment Agency, which regulates their impact on the environment. And one of the stories of the past 20 years is that the regulators have been asleep on the job. And one very senior person in the water industry said to me earlier this year, unfortunately, after they'd read the book, so after I'd written it, that in their view, the regulator and the companies had conspired, which I thought was a very interesting choice of word, between them down the years to keep the amount of money that the companies invested in upgrading their plant and equipment, including their sewage plants, at the very minimum of level that was permitted by the law. And instead, the companies have been allowed to pay their shareholders astronomical dividends. Money that could have gone into, at least in part, into maintaining and upgrading the infrastructure. And that is one reason, it's not the only reason, but it is one reason why we now have a huge number of sewage plants all over the country, sewage treatment plants, which are discharging as a matter of routine untreated sewage onto beaches and into watercourses. And it's not easy to see how you fix that, because it will cost a lot of money, it will take a long time. And the companies, it now transpires, having given all this money to their shareholders, and then having borrowed loads of money at very low interest rates, don't have any money. Thames Water, the biggest, astonishingly, has had to go cap in hand to its shareholders for extra funds, because it was in danger of going bust, because interest rates have gone through the roof, and these borrowings are now very difficult for them to finance. So the water industry is in a complete mess, and it's really quite shocking. And I'm afraid it's an object lesson. Historians will be writing about it in the future as to why why regulation fails. Well-intentioned regulation.
Okay.
So you had a question, Dan. You have to wait until the microphone reaches you, please.
I was wondering how they dispose of the used sand from the filter beds, of which there must be quite a large amount. What do they do with it?
That's an interesting question. I said I just don't know the answer. It's much of it is reused. It's washed. The photograph that I showed you showed a filter bed that had been drained so that the sand could be washed. You could see the little piles of sand. And that still happens. If you go down to Hampton today, where it's still an important waterworks, and you can see the filter beds, you'll often see a couple of them which have been drained. So as far as I know, the stuff is just recycled endlessly, topped up occasionally with sand. It always seemed to come from Harwich, certainly in the 19th century. I don't know what it was about Harwich sand, which was particularly appealing for this process, but I don't think disposal is a problem. There was another hand.
Any other questions at the back there? Yes.
Any ladies? I made a mistake. Somebody once said to me, if you ask a question and answer, don't ask a man to ask the first question. Wait until a woman puts her hand up, and then ask the woman, because then all the other women will also ask questions. It's interesting. Yes, sir.
You mentioned at the beginning of your talk Mr. Middleton.
Yes,
as a founder. Is there any connection with Middleton House in Enfield?
Yes, and I get a bit lost here because there were a lot of Middletons. Hugh was one of, I think it was 7 brothers, all of whom were high achievers. They came from North Wales, and one of his brothers, Thomas, became Lord Mayor of London. And I think it was that Thomas who gave his name to Middleton Hall. And as it happens, this is coincidental, the New River runs through the grounds of Middleton Hall. But some people say to me, was that where Hugh Middleton lived? And he didn't. He had a house at Bush Hill, south of Enfield, while he was, and possibly afterwards, while he was constructing the New River. So that was his sort of country residence.
Any other questions, please? Yep, okay, one moment.
You mentioned people paying for their water. How was the money actually collected? Did they have people knocking on doors or what?
The water companies employed, along with the turncocks going around, they employed collectors. who went round twice a year. You paid every 6 months, and they had a book, and they knocked on every door, and if you weren't in, they came back and they collected the money. And that was a very lucrative line of work. And Dickens has a water company collector in Nicholas Nickleby, I think, called Mr. Lilyvick, who is an object of considerable interest to his relatives, because they hope that he will leave them his riches, and then he goes and marries an actress, which rather screws that up. But yeah, it was a very, very lucrative business, quite a responsible one. And if you got it wrong, they'd throw you out. They thought you were embezzling or incompetent, they would throw you out sharpish. But that was how it was done. Anyone else? Any other questions? Yes.
More for any more, yeah. It's not a question, it's just a little story. The New River ran at the back of my grandparents' house in Uvedale Road, Enfield. Oh, yes. And I've been in the river. My family were playing football on the bank, and seemingly my father knocked me in when I was a toddler, and he hit water before I did.
Right, good for him. Well, not good for him for knocking you in, but good for him for getting you out. You share that with James I, actually, who had a much closer relationship with the river than most of the other shareholders, because it ran through the park at Theobald's or Tybalt's, his country residence. Again, I'm a bit lost in this part of North London. Anyway, Tybalt's not far from here. And one January morning, apparently, he was out hunting in the park, and his horse threw him, and he went through the ice into the frozen New River and had to be fished out with his boots, by his boots. So he had an intimate acquaintance with the New River as well. Any more?
Any more questions? Any more for any more?
Okay.
No? Okay.
Let me then give you, very briefly, very quickly, a short history of laundry. That is a picture of Samuel Pepys, the famous diarist. And on Monday, the 26th of October, 1663, he wrote in his diary, "Waked about 1 o'clock in the morning, my wife, being waked, rung her bell, and the maids rose and went to washing. We to sleep again till 7 o'clock, and then up, and I abroad." And another rather later entry in the diary gives a clue as to why he went abroad or out for the day. "After done several businesses at the Change, I home, and being washing day, dined upon cold meat." Poor Samuel. Why was there nothing hot to eat? And why did the maids have to get up so early? Because it was washing day. Well, pre-modern world, doing the washing involved hot water. And in most households, the only place to heat water was on the kitchen fire, which also doubled as the place where you cook food. And I don't know what the Pepys kitchen looked like, but whatever it looked like, it would have been taken over by the maids completely for the purpose of washing for the entire day. And they got up early, partly to revive the kitchen fire in order to heat the water, which of course would take quite a long time, partly because so much work was involved in doing the laundry that they needed to get started very, very early. And of course, when kitchen technology improved with the invention of sort of patent stoves like this, didn't make life any easier, because you still didn't have hot water on tap. You still had to put stuff on the stove and heat it. Why did people put up with this? Well, washing clothes was the way you kept yourself clean. People in early modern England did not wash themselves. They might wash their hands and their faces, but they didn't wash any other part of their body. What they did wash, however, was their linen undergarments, shirts and shifts and so on, which were worn next to the body and which absorbed sweat and odors, and so made you really quite nice to know. However, there was a lot of work involved in doing the laundry. The water had to be heated, the clothes had to be moved around, they had to be rinsed once they'd been soaked, and this work was almost all done by women. So poor Samuel Pepys doesn't deserve much in the way of pity, because he was fine. He went off while the women folk of the house did all the hard manual labour. What did they wash the clothes with apart from water? You needed soap, you needed other cleaning agents. Well, one cleaning agent was readily obtainable from your chamber pot. Urine, stale urine, turns to ammonia, which is a very effective bleach. So the thriftless housewife might chuck the contents of the chamber pot out into the street shouting "Gardy-loo," but a more sensible person would store the household's urine away until the next washing day, when you might soak the household clothes in it. If you did use soap, it was probably homemade again. What you would do is you would take wood ash. If it came from the kitchen fire, it would be called potash, and you would mix that with tallow. Now, this is a jar from Waitrose or somewhere of beef tallow, and is no doubt a luxury food product, but tallow actually is obtained by rendering down the carcasses of dead animals, and it was a notoriously smelly and unpleasant business. And tallow was used instead of wax for candles, which smelt, and for making soap, which smelt. And the soap made the clothes smell. You could, if you had lots of money, buy much more expensive soap, which was imported. It came from the Mediterranean, where it was made with the ash of Mediterranean salt marsh plants, and it was known as castle soap because it came from Castile originally. As I say, washing was women's work. There were occasions when men were forced to do it, but if you saw a man with his hands in the tub, something had almost certainly gone wrong with his life. And here you have an illustration of some poor chap forced to do the washing while his wife lays desperately ill, possibly dying. And up behind him, you can see hanging up in front of the fire, the family smalls. Most washing was done by women, and there are lots of pictures by genre painters showing laundry maids at work. Most of the painters were men, and most of the painters seemed to find the idea of women up to their elbows in water rather sexy. So quite a lot of these images are, frankly, titillating. The reality was rather different, because this was hard work and you needed to be strong to do it. So it's wrong to talk about laundry maids, rather sort of prissy. Actually, they were washerwomen. And when you see some of the photographs, you realize why Toad in Lord of the Rings, in Wind in the Willows, was able to disguise himself as a washerwoman, because they weren't renowned for their beauty. There's another picture, and yet another one. But it could be quite a decent trade, if one that tended to drive its practitioners to drink. And while I was researching this, I came across a rather wonderful poem about a washerwoman. Toiling, this needs to be said really with a Cockney accent, but I'm not going to embark on a Cockney accent. Toiling, boiling all the day, rubbing, slushing, sloshing, firsting, bursting every way, going out a washing. I gets my 18 pence a day, with grub and gin, however, as much as I can put away to keep my strength together. Weak folks say it's all a sin, and at us get reviling, but there's nothing like a drop of gin to keep the copper boiling. And you see why it needs to be said with a Cockney accent. Mostly, we don't know what these washerwomen thought. The words can be put into their mouths by male writers and so on, but they're a closed book. But there was one 18th century washerwoman, not in London, but in Hampshire, who was not only literate, but who wrote poetry. And she wrote something called Women's Labour, an epistle to Mr. Stephen Duck. Stephen Duck was another poet of the era who'd been rather dismissive of women, claiming that men did all the hard work and women had it easy. Where have we heard that before? She was a washerwoman, and she describes in her poem going out to do the washing at the big house near where she lived, having to get up much earlier in the morning than her husband, who was merely going to work on a farm, and having to stand around in the freezing cold because the maid hasn't woken up yet and isn't there to let her in, then having to deal with an imperious mistress who demands this and demands that. And she writes, now we drive on and resolved our strength to try, and what we can we do most willingly, until with heat and work 'tis often known, not only sweat, but blood runs trickling down our wrists and fingers. Still our work demands the constant action of our labouring hands. And I suspect that's not an exaggeration. It wasn't hard work that made your fingers bleed. It was having them constantly in water, chapped, day in, day out, and soapy water. There were labour-saving devices on the market. The one on the left is called a dolly, or possibly a posser. I get them muddled up, but a dolly or posser was, and the one on the right is called a posser, or possibly a dolly. They were used to agitate the clothes. You put them into some sort of container or tub, and you slosh them about. They did make life easier, still very hard work, made easier, I read, if you were wearing a corset, because the corset gave support to your lower back. And then, of course, when you'd done the water and you'd done the soapy water, and then you'd got rid of the soapy water, which would involve carrying the water somewhere to where you could tip it into a drain, then you had to get clean water, which may have to come from a pump or from some distant place, probably more than one rinse of cold water, so a huge amount of fetching and carrying. Then you had to dry the clothes. That was fine if you lived in the country and the weather was good. But if you lived in the city, which in the case of London, at any rate, in the 18th, 19th century, was incredibly polluted with coal, dust and smuts and soot. So anything you hung out for any length of time would get covered in black stuff. It must have been a complete nightmare. This is a wonderful image by Gustave Doré from his sequence of images of London. It's Doré was a wonderful artist. He's not reliable. He didn't sketch anything on the ground. He went and had a look, made mental notes, and then went home and worked it all up. So it's possible that this is misleading, because all these backyards have got laundry hanging out to dry. That may have been an invention of Doré's, but if it wasn't an invention, close to the railway line, close to steam-driven pumping engines and steam-driven machinery of all sorts, it would have been a complete nightmare. So many people hung clothes up in their homes, which meant that many a kitchen was like Mrs. Dumpling's establishment. And forgive me, I forget what this is an illustration to. It's some novel you've never heard of by a Victorian writer you've never heard of. But you can see Mrs. Dumpling, apart from having a son who tries to balance chairs on his nose, has lots of washing hanging up behind her. And that led to the invention of this wonderful device, which I remember in the house we moved into, new build house in 1957. We had one of these, and it's called a Sally. I always forget this. I want to call it a Lazy Susan, but it's not. It's called a Sally something, and it was marvelous, very effective. And if you want to know more about laundry in the years, the centuries before the invention of the washing machine, then the place to go is Audley End, near Saffron Walden, which is a fine country house. It's owned by English Heritage. It's got lots of interesting things to see. One of the things it has is the restored Audley End laundry. And that has got, because lots of people lived in a country house, so there was lots of people's stuff that had to be washed. It's got a whole row of sinks and washboards and so on, tubs in one room. In the corner, it's got the pump, which supplied the water, which would then be carried over to one of these two enormous coal-fired coppers, which were built in and would heat the water. Then when the water was hot, you notice there's no sort of tap, so you had to dip something in and get the hot water out. As I said, an awful lot of fetching and carrying involved in this sort of activity. It has dollies and possers, or possibly dollies, for stirring everything about. And outside, it has this rather dinky little truck, the Audley End House Laundry painted on it, because actually Audley End had two laundries. It had the one I've just shown you, which was the wet laundry, and then it had round the corner the dry laundry, which was where the clothes were dried. Here they were hung up from the ceiling, and the room would have been heated, and on one of the stoves you can see lots of irons, smoothing irons, which would have been used, sorry, too far, which would have been used to press the clothes, including the use of starch. I need to research starch. I need to find out why starch was an almost universal use, because it makes the whole process much more complex. What was it about starch that our ancestors so liked? Not just making your collars stiff. But anyway, starch would have been applied. And in one corner, there is this. Now, in the house that we moved into in 1957, there was a Sally thing hanging from the ceiling. There was also, my mother had a mangle on top of her twin tub washing machine, which was really quite a small thing. You just put the clothes through and squeeze the water out of them. This is a real, proper mangle. This is enormous, and it's filled with stones. And what it did two things. It pressed the water out of the folded clothes, but it also gave things like sheets a crease. And mangles were a very important part of a washerwoman's equipment, not necessarily as big as this. And in the 19th century, in the Victorian period, if you were unlucky enough to be killed in an industrial accident, but lucky enough to work for a considerate employer, that employer might buy your widow a mangle, so she had a way of earning a living in your absence. She could set herself up as a washerwoman with this vital but quite expensive piece of kit. And there is another of Dickens's novels, not Dombey and Son, Our Mutual Friend. There's a washerwoman there, Betty Higden, who has a youth called whose job it is to work the mangle, and he, unlike Betty, can read, and as he's turning the handle and she's doing the washing, he reads the newspapers to her, and as she proudly says, he do the police in different voices, which was a wonderful line that T.S. Eliot appropriated as the title for his first draft of The Wasteland. And what's he called? Is he called Sloppy? I think he's called Sloppy or Slopey, something like that. And he would have operated a mangle possibly like this. And he may have known, or at least sympathized with whoever came up with this song, which should be sung to the tune of a popular mid-19th century marching song, but I'm not going to attempt the tune. The words go, "Cheer, boys, cheer. My mother bought a mangle. Cheer, boys, cheer. She filled it full of stones. Cheer, boys, cheer. She makes me turn the handle. Cheer, boys, cheer. It nearly breaks my bones." And that's a very, very short history of laundry. Thank you very much.
Nick, thank you very much. Fascinating talk. Are there any questions for Nick before we finish this evening? Any questions out there?
Any questions? Anybody
Any more
anybody else
questions?
want to buy a book? Oh, yes, there's a lady down the front.
Question?
More of an observation. When you're using a mangle, the thing you've got to do if you've got sheets is make sure you've got them folded up correctly so that you haven't got to do too much ironing when you've finished.
Yes, yes. Folding sheets, though, folding damp full-size sheets is a nightmare. I mean, it's worst thing doing the ironing in our house. It's the worst job, actually, especially if there's only one of you. It's all right if there are two of you to fold a sheet, but if there's one of you, getting it square is a nightmare.
Oh, you still use it?
One more.
I just wondered when you said that they collected for the water bills, they house by house. For how long did that last? I mean, when did it change?
The Metropolitan Water Board inherited teams of collectors from all the water companies in 1904, but by, I think, the 1920s or 30s, it started to move over to a system where you paid by post or you went to their offices and paid. And I forget the date, I think it's in the book, they recruited their last collectors in about 1930 something, but basically the idea of collectors was on the way out. The lady over here.
One moment, please, one moment.
This is another observation. My brother worked for Thames Water, Metropolitan Water Board, and he was in bill collection. And if there were overdue bills and he fancied a day out, he'd go what they called on the district and go to places where people were owing a bill. He went around Hampstead, all sorts of places.
Yes.
So
And knock on the door.
Yeah, he was also responsible for the installation of the metering system, so he moved on from.
There is when the Metropolitan Water Board came into being, it started a staff magazine which contained for several years articles looking back to the bad old days of the water companies, and one of those allegedly by someone who worked for the East London Waterworks, suggested that one of the collectors used to take a gun with him and brandish it at anybody who was a reluctant payer. It sounds like an old wives' tale to me, but who knows, might have been true. Right then.
Okay, so Nick, thank you once again
Not at all.
for
My
your
pleasure.
talk. Let's
Thank
give Nick one last. One moment, please. We've got someone online who wants to give.
Oh gosh.
Well, Jennifer says the Sally thing that you mentioned, they just call it a pulley.
Oh yeah.
And they've got one, and it works really well and cheap for drying.
It absolutely.
And there's actually quite a few people saying thank you for a fascinating talk.
Well, that's
so
very good.
I've just summarised that.
Thank you very much for having me.
Okay, let's thank Nick once again. Thank you.
Not at all. All the best.
Lovely.